Okay, today we're going to be talking about travel change, specifically how to change the travel in your new 9.1 front fork. Please note that when changing the travel of your 9.1 fork, you may or may not have to also change the spring rate of your fork. Please refer to the 9.1 support page located on our website for our complete spring rate guide, or feel free to reach out to our customer service for guidance in spring rate. For today's travel change, we're going to need a few hand tools. We're going to need a 4mm hex key, a 3/8 ratchet with your 9.1 pin tool. We'll need an 11mm box wrench, a 13mm socket, a 2mm hex key, a flat blade screwdriver, and a torque wrench. So the travel change in your 9.1 fork is done by removing the spring plunger assembly. In order to do that, we need to remove the air bump stop, the actual coil spring, and that'll give us access to that plunger that we can then drop out through the bottom of the fork. So for the first step, we're going to remove the air bump stop and the coil spring. In order to do that, we're going to take our 4mm hex key and we're going to loosen the bottom bolt of the axle lug. Next, we're going to remove the dust cap on the air bump stop by turning it counterclockwise. We remove that and it will expose the cap, which we then remove using our 9.1 pin tool. To remove the air bump stop, we're going to take our 9.1 pin tool, insert it into the cap, and turn counterclockwise. Once the cap is completely loosened, now we can remove the air bump stop and the spring. During this process, you may see grease and oil come out with the air bump stop and spring. That's completely normal. With the air bump stop and the main coil spring removed, now we're going to focus on removing the plunger assembly. The first step in that is to simply turn the dust cap at the top of the fork counterclockwise, unthreading it. Next, again, we're going to use our 9.1 pin tool, insert it into the top cap, and remove by turning counterclockwise. With the top cap completely loosened, we're going to compress the fork slightly to allow us to pull up on the cap to expose the rod and the bottoming bumper. Now that we have the top cap and plunger exposed, we need to slide the bottoming bumper down slightly to access the wrench flats on the rod. I'm going to use a flat blade screwdriver and just gently get it in between the cap and the bumper to wiggle it away to allow me to gain access to the wrench flats on the rod. Next, we're going to remove the top cap from the plunger rod using an 11mm box wrench and a 13mm socket. We're going to locate the 11mm wrench on the wrench flats of the rod, and using a 13mm socket on the top, we're going to simply loosen this up. This rod does have blue Loctite on it, so it will be a little stiff to unthread, and that's normal. Once loosened, we can then remove the stud completely along with the top cap. With the stud and the top cap removed, we can now slide the bottoming bumper off of the rod, which will allow the rod to now drop through the bottom of the fork. With the plunger rod removed, we now need to reposition the piston to the desired travel setting. On the spring plunger piston is a red bearing with 2 tabs. We'll simply pull on the tabs, which will allow us to remove it from the piston itself. This exposes the roll pin that allows us to change the position of the piston. Using a 2mm hex key, we'll simply push the pin out, which then will allow the piston to freely move up and down to different travel positions. So on the plunger piston, the lowest position is 140 travel, moving up one position is 150, another is 160, and all the way to the top is 170mm of travel. To set the travel, we align the hole in the piston with the hole in the rod and simply reinstall the roll pin. Now that the roll pin has been completely secured into the desired travel position, we're going to take our red spring bearing and snap it back on top of the piston. Now that we have the travel in the desired position, we need to reinstall the plunger rod. We'll do this by installing the plunger end first, And then using the coil spring will help guide the plunger up the fork tube. It will get to a certain position and you'll feel it generally stop. This is where we'll use a 2mm hex key to go down inside the fork to guide the rod into the center of the bushing and up through the top. Now that we have the rod exposed, we're going to maintain pressure with the fork spring to allow us to install the bottoming bumper. Once the bottoming bumper is slid in place, this will hold the rod, which will allow us to remove the fork spring. Prior to installing the top cap and the stud, we're going to be careful to remove any excess Loctite that may be located on the stud threads. With the stud threads now cleaned, we're going to apply a light ring of Loctite 243 to the larger diameter threads on the stud. With the blue Loctite now added to the stud, we're going to locate the top cap and then thread the stud into the plunger rod, being sure to torque to 8 Newton meters. With the top cap and stud now torqued to 8 Newton meters, we're going to reinstall the cap, threading it clockwise and torquing it to 26 Newton meters. With the top cap now reinstalled and torqued to 26 Newton meters, we're going to install the dust cap by turning it clockwise. Now that we have the upper plunger assembly completely installed, we need to reinstall the fork spring and the air bump stop unit. During the installation of the upper assembly, we ended up compressing the fork slightly. To install the fork spring and the ABS unit, we want to have the fork completely extended. When extending the fork, you might experience a slight vacuum that wants to draw the fork back into the legs. In order to remove that vacuum, simply pull on the fork, pull on the bleeder to remove any vacuumed air, and that will allow the fork to stay completely extended. Having a liberal amount of grease on the fork spring helps with reducing friction and increasing small bump sensitivity. If your fork spring needs additional grease, we recommend using Motorex Bike Grease 2000 by simply brushing it on the spring prior to reinstalling it. With a liberal amount of grease, we're simply going to slide the fork spring back into the leg and then reinstall the air bump stop. We'll reinstall the air bump stop using our 9.1 pin tool and turning it clockwise. Final torque set to 26 Newton meters. Now that we have the fork spring and the air bump stop reinstalled, the final step is to re-torque the lower axle lug bolt to 4 Newton meters and then reinstall the air bump stop dust cap by turning it clockwise until tight. So with just a few easy steps, we've now changed the travel in your 9.1 front fork. For more information, feel free to check out pushindustries.com.